Now we're going to turn to Pamela Scott to learn about two Irishmen who made major imprints on the nation's capital by forming the green spaces of Washington that framed the principal public buildings and the byways in which citizens traveled around the new city. Pam Scott is a leading authority on the history of public buildings in Washington, an architectural historian whose dogged research has found expression in many exhibitions, as well as publications including the books Temple of Liberty, the United States Capitol Building, Buildings of the District of Columbia, and Fortress of Finance, her comprehensive work on the several design and construction phases of the U.S. Treasury Building. Now, they say that nothing on the internet ever really disappears, and usually that's a bad thing. But I was last week watching an old U.S. Capitol historical lecture series back from 2005 in which Pam was lecturing on the Capitol Gardens and grounds. And then, and I'm sure this morning, I learned about John Foy and James Mayer's work up on Jenkins Hill, and I hope we'll also hear about their efforts this morning at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. So please welcome, Pamela Scott.
You see that right away I'm being troublesome because I have added two additional Irish landscape architects to this mix. But let me first introduce myself in terms of how I come to be considered appropriate person to speak at this conference. Emmeline Kelly was my maternal grandmother. She was born in the Maritime Provinces shortly after her parents, Patrick and Mary Kelly, emigrated from Cork. She was educated as a teacher. My mother is the portrait of her as I knew her as a young woman. Beneath her portrait in the old photograph was the only one of four siblings to be educated as a teacher. And in 2008, I retired from teaching for Cornell University after 42 years. So I have a certain Irish background, that is to say, a quarter of me is. And it is an interesting point that her husband was 6'2". She was about my size. All four of her children physically were like her. And if you think of genes being associated and passed on with strength and with largeness of frame, as I tend to do because I'm not scientific, then the Irish was very strong in all of us. I grew up on my grandparents' farm in southern Maine, and I firmly believed that my grandmother's herbaceous border was my own, and I routinely every spring would transplant the horse chestnut seedlings, the American chestnut seedlings, into her herbaceous border. They were almost extinct because of an 1880s importation of Japanese chestnuts, but they have been brought back, and the chestnut, that blossom that you see on the right, is now at the Yale University grounds. So the four Irish gardeners I'm going to talk about include John Owsley at the President's House, and then John Saul, who inherited the mantle of the work of the earlier three. I will concentrate on both Foy and Marr, but the others deserve to be introduced to you and placed in the context of the entire horticultural tradition in Washington during the 19th century, because they dominated that field. Both Foy and Marr are considered to have been born in Roscommon at Castlereagh, the home of the O'Connor family. Clonalis is seen here as it is today. And because there's confusion about Foy's actual birthplace and heritage, and because, believe it or not, there are literally thousands of John Foys who emigrated to America in the 18th and 19th century. Dennis and I collaborated on looking into this a little bit, and Dennis believes that because of the history of the O'Connor family as being descended from the ancient kings of Ireland, and its importance regionally, and the importance of the house and the landscape, that there would have been a horticultural tradition where possibly the young men of local families would have been trained as gardeners or horticulturalists. Here you see John Foy's two known private clients. On the left is Rufus King. He was a member of Congress who then in 1796 became the American minister to London. And he came back to New York. The gentleman on the right is Henry Clay, the American essayist and poet. Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1844 wrote that Europe stretches to the Alleghenies. America lies beyond, because of the extraordinary divide between the New West and the old inherited country. Clay was the known, a bit is known about Foy's work for Clay. He may have met him in Europe and brought him back, but in 1815, Clay begins the serious development of his house, Ashland, which is now part of Lexington, Kentucky. And this is the earliest view of it from 1843, but you see the importance here of fir trees and evergreens. The 1870s landscaping portrait of the house, totally engulfed by fir trees with a few deciduous ones around and about, is an important development that is growing out of, I think, Foy's education and knowledge and just the experience of having grown up where he did. This is what was originally identified as the gardener's cottage at Ashland, and may well have been where Foy lived during the 3 years that he spent working on the grounds. At the same time that he's working as Clay's gardener, he is also running a side business by selling seeds, seedlings, and trees in the general area. And this became a part of the whole tradition among these horticulturalists in Washington, in that the only way they could support themselves was to have a side business, because their salaries, the government salaries, were very low. They were comparable to laborers in the federal government, and not to, say, the people who were the the bricklayers and so forth, but rather to the laboring class. The capital's early landscape history is defined by what was taken away rather than what remained. And what remained are the 13 trees on the west front looking towards the mall and the White House. 13, of course, being the magic number. But when the land was cleared, this was all that was left to remain as the landscape for the Capitol. Now, the tradition of a picturesque garden in Washington, and the tradition begins with Benjamin Henry Latrobe. This is his a plan from 1802 of the White House grounds that has three hands associated with it. Nicholas King, who was the city surveyor, Robert Mills, who was Latrobe's young student. He was from Charleston, South Carolina. And then the very strong hand on the right-hand side, where the rather meek and mild development of the rest of the plan, Latrobe comes in and with a couple of swirls say, no, we're going to make this something much more dynamic with a winding roadways, pathways, and great clumps of trees. His 1806 presentation, watercolor to Thomas Jefferson, of the Capitol as both Jefferson and Latrobe had redesigned it from the original, the East Front, also shows the tradition of the picturesque and its importance, I think in Latrobe's eyes, because he associated it with freedom, and that there was both a literary and a physical tradition of it. So you have groups of trees planted strategically to both shade the major rooms in the Capitol, but also groupings because the Capitol grounds were open to the public from the beginning. So were the White House grounds, but they were closed later. And Latrobe's 1815 map, this map was made to show Latrobe's solution for the low-lying grounds, where the tidal, whenever there was a high tide or a heavy storm, then the whole west end of the mall was underwater. And this is Latrobe's solution to it through various canals and picturesque ponds and so forth. And you see just from the way he's indicated the plantings that it was, in his mind at this point, solidly established that the American landscape and its whole history and its natural state that existed then had to be developed in the public grounds as a continuation of it. John Foy came to Washington at the behest of those two men, Rufus King and Henry Clay, who were both members of Congress. They both wrote him letters of recommendation. He moved to a little village called Irishtown. The detail on the right is from a Latrobe sketch in which he's written on the top Irishtown. Below the clouds, it's difficult to decipher, but it says Washington. The image on the left, done by a French artist, shows, can you see beneath the poplars, Lombardy poplars, there are a series of buildings. That was Irishtown, and it was built by Daniel Carroll of Duddington as the little community to house his workmen on his buildings, as well as the other Irish who would be working on Capitol Hill. Right to the left, very hard to see, and I noticed that the screen is quivering. You see the two wings of the Capitol, but if you go all the way to the left, you can see a building at the top. That was a double house that George Washington commissioned. He designed it himself. He commissioned it to be built in 1798 as rental houses for members of Congress. It was his contribution towards the development of the city, and in order to populate the city. I tried to correlate the dates of when Irishtown was created and when Washington's house was created for a very interesting reason, and we're going to see a little bit in my presentation, the anti-Irish sentiment. Carroll is creating Irishtown, but George Washington in 1775 did a remarkable thing when he was in charge of the American troops at Cambridge, Massachusetts. The November 5th is celebrated in England as Guy Fawkes Day. Guy Fawkes was an English Catholic who tried and failed to burn the Houses of Parliament. And so still today, Guy Fawkes is celebrated. In the colonies, it was celebrated, but especially in New England, it was called Pope's Day. And like the Guy Fawkes celebrations, an effigy was made of the Pope that was burned as the Guy Fawkes tradition was, until 1775, when the New Englanders were getting ready to celebrate it. And George Washington issued an order that none of the troops under his command, which came from around the country, were to participate in the Pope's Day celebration. And that is apparently the last time that, if we can call it celebration, was celebrated in America. Or that from then on, it was never celebrated again. At the very bottom of that, unfortunately, difficult to read image, can you see at the very bottom of this, which is at the very bottom of the image, the rows of plantings, so that you have plantations there of trees. These are the gardens that Foy started, and they continued to expand to provide the trees and the shrubbery that he then carried out at the Capitol. Charles Bulfinch was replaced Latrobe as the architect of the Capitol in 1818, and he also redesigned his whole concept of how the Capitol was to be situated in a much more formal way. That rows of trees would line all the streets and avenues leading to the Capitol, as well as going down to the mall. The image on the left is oriented so that the top is towards the mall and the bottom is towards Capitol Hill. The drawing on the right is one of several done by an English topographical artist, John Reuben Smith, that shows Bulfinch's Capitol completed, and with the planting of the trees now in the newly opened and landscaped avenues south of the Capitol, and you see them in their tree boxes. This is an unusual image because in reality, what John Foy did was to lay out gravel footpaths 10 feet wide inside of the iron fence that was designed by Bulfinch. And on both sides of that 10-foot wide gravel pathway, he planted shrubs and here show them as they existed, as they were maturing in about 1828. And here they are on the mall side of the Capitol, along what was called the Circular Road, about the same period of time. So you had now the introduction of something that was much more exuberant in terms of green matter, along which all the visitors to the Capitol walked as they made the circuit of the Capitol. It was this feature that led Foy to a much more extensive part of his career. John Quincy Adams, as president from 1825 to 1829, was well known at the time to awaken early in the morning and to go directly during warm weather to the Potomac River, where he had his morning swim. As soon as it got cold, however, in 1825, and too cold to swim in the Potomac, he walked every morning at first light from the White House to the Capitol, and he did the circuit of Foy's walkway. Initially, it took him an hour and 20 minutes, but he finally got it down to an hour. And during that time, he made friends with Foy. It then led to his work at the president's house and grounds. The watercolor here is usually dated to 1826, but I think it needs a little bit more research. You notice on the lower left there is a fenced-in plantation of trees. These might have been the trees that Adams and Foy worked together in planting. John Owsley, who was the main gardener at the White House, was still very much in charge of all the grounds. He was Irish, of course. Let me just quote from John Quincy Adams' diary from November 3, 1826. Spoke to Foy about laying off a small piece of ground within the yard walls of the house for planting nuts and acorns and other sorts of forest trees. I will make a nursery here where the experiment might be tried of raising forest trees, foreign and domestic, from the seed, nut, or acorn. Several times Foy recounts that was his basic way of gathering material for his gardens, was to go out into the forests, which he routinely did, and gathered all the seeds, which he then planted in public, on either rented or leased land where he had his nursery. And I believe that this was the nursery. Owsley's gardens that he did with Adams were on the east end of the White House, and they are out of view just because of the way that Anthony St. John Baker, the point of view that he took in showing this. But this also shows you very much more vividly than any prints of the day, which glorified what was already completed. This shows you what the actual physical condition of the land was as late as 1826. back to the Capitol and to Foy's maturing, not totally matured, but his maturing landscape, which he began on the north side of the Capitol and gradually moved to the south. We now have what becomes a standard in his work of the very free intermingling of deciduous and conifer trees. This is a John Reuben Smith image, as is this. Now we're looking at the mall side of the Capitol as it is completed by Charles Bulfinch. The green berm that you see had a walkway on the top, and then that second walkway. That second lower walkway is not the edge of the Capitol grounds, but rather it is just the bottom level area. The actual Capitol grounds are hidden, Edge Street, the circular road is hidden behind the greenery. The greenery is the first botanical garden that was begun by individuals in the city, all of whom had a deep interest in horticulture. Foy was their landscapist. So what you see here inside the fence is the little picket fence. Just beyond the cows, there's a picket fence that encloses this, where Foy's actual manuscript of all of the trees and shrubs that he planted there exists with their Latin names, a very extensive list. Late in his career, which is only extended until 1833 when he died, he noted that his goal was to have collected in Washington and the various grounds he did in Washington 8,000 species of Native American plants. So that was a very ambitious goal. That little teeny part of Irish town that Foy had taken over included a hotel that he and his wife ran. And but for that hotel, they would not have been able to survive financially. 5 years before he died, he sent to Ireland, to Roscommon, for John Foy, who we presume is his cousin. Literally, very difficult to figure out all the Foys. So that John Foy came and took over the hotel. And when Foy died, his entire estate consisted of $137.87 worth of household goods. So fortunately, either because he felt that he was ill and may soon die, he sent for the cousin to take over the money-making property, or it just became too much of a burden with all of the additional work that he had to do. Because once he had begun working with John Quincy Adams at the President's house, it mushroomed. In 1832, he wrote a 4-page petition to Congress in which he states right on the first page, as you can see, that he was hired initially just to do the ornamental work of the Capitol grounds. But then John Quincy Adams asked him to work at the White House. From there, he went on to do the War Department building grounds, the State Department building grounds, the Arsenal grounds, and the Navy Yard grounds. And he is asking in this petition that Congress consider not only paying him for the fact that he had already done this work, but for future employment. This petition was tabled and never acted on. He became, late in his career, much more of an essayist. He wrote 3 or 4 articles that were published in the National Intelligencer, including one in 1832 that suggested water be transmitted to the public buildings as well as all the private structures in Washington via a system of reservoirs rather than via a system of bringing it to the capital city via big iron tubes. 20 years after he suggested it, another very prominent figure in Washington history, Montgomery Meigs, built the whole water system from using basically the same principle that Foy had suggested. Now, turning to James Marr, who we know is also from Roscommon, and whose actual education or apprenticeship must have been in landscape architecture in Europe as well, was working in Philadelphia when Foy died, and 8 days later was hired as his replacement. He also owned a hotel. Soon after coming, within 2 years, he had a major hotel on the south side of Pennsylvania Avenue around 12th Street, one block in, called the Globe Hotel. And it was the 1830s and 40s was a period when Indian delegations were coming and signing treaties at the president's house, and many stayed at the Globe. And the famous story about Marr, and there were many stories because he was your typical Irish character of the period. One of the stories was that when they stayed at his hotel, he spoke to them in Gaelic. They spoke to him in their native languages, and they understood one another perfectly. This is Pennsylvania Avenue with the Capitol in the background in 1861. It is the continuation of the culmination of a tradition that Marr began within a year of becoming the public gardener, as his title was. And that was the planting of street trees on all of the major streets and avenues of Washington. Started out, obviously, little by little. And you see that you have a continuation of the tradition of a mixture of kinds of trees that existed both in the Capitol grounds and in the White House grounds, in the avenue that visually connected them. In 1836, Marr produced this plan for the extension of the Capitol grounds, because during this period of time, he is twice a year, he is submitting invoices that are detailed and list how many trees of what species he is planting where for the official records. He routinely would plant between 1,000 and 1,500 at both times of the year, some of them for the streets and some. And my contention is that this plan for extending the Capitol grounds was so that he had a larger palette to work with. because the number of trees that were being planted yearly, not that many could die off every year. The number of trees was really phenomenal. He started out having his nursery on 16th Street between H and I Streets, which is very close to the White House. By the end of his career, he had a huge nursery on 16th Street between N and O Streets, which is way up at the top of the hill, where there were 8,000 of one species, 10,000 of another, 3,000 of another, as a huge operation. While Foy comes off as rather serious and studious, Marr comes off as a great businessman in comparison, and also a very colorful character. So in the end, the Capitol literally was floating on a sea of green. This is 1839, and you see how strong the tree tradition is within not only the public buildings, but along the streets. Looking now east, most of the views of the Capitol are looking towards the mall. This is now looking towards the residential part of Capitol Hill, but you see that by the time Marr has totally closed in, has moved up the hill and closed in the entire landscape with trees. Now, the White House grounds were open to the public, and so at the same time, events were happening in both places. The Marine Band was playing, July 4th celebrations, inaugurations. There were public events used very frequently, both places. Looking from the Capitol grounds down Pennsylvania Avenue, you see the Foy's circle at the bottom of the hill. So you had a reciprocal green effect from both places. This is a part of a list from Foy's, one of Foy's documents that he sent that listed the Irish laborers that were working with him in the Capitol grounds. The completion of the Capitol in the mid-1850s, nothing tells the story, no print quite competes with a photograph to show just how dense that planting was by the mid-1850s. And you see that the street planting on both sides of the circular road. Now, Foy was associated with John Quincy Adams, but Marr was hired by and associated with Andrew Jackson to a very great extent. And apparently they were great friends personally. The dating of this is 1853, just after Foy died. And at this point, both Andrew Jackson and Foy have passed. And we have to go back now to 1848 chronologically, because July 4th, 1848, the cornerstone was laid for the Washington Monument. 1848 in Irish history, of course, is very, very important because of the Great Famine and the great emigration to America. Many of the Irish who came to the Washington area worked as laborers building the Washington Monument. And out of this grew the Know Nothing Party, a political party that was anti-Catholic, but which was really anti-Irish, because these Irish laborers were working for less money than the quote-unquote Americans who are now established were working. They were working, the Irish were working to survive. They were paid $1 a day. to labor at the Washington Monument. This refers to part of the story of Mar, and of course it's the anti-Irish, as your typical drunk, was the part of the anti-Catholicism. This is published in Boston in 1853, which is still and we think of the Irish in Boston as a very strong group, but there was a strong anti-Catholic and anti-Irish element as they moved in to that community at that time as well. The last little bit of history of Mar was that he was a Republican in the Jeffersonian tradition and in the Jacksonian tradition. He was a leading figure in convincing President Tyler to move the statue of Thomas Jefferson that had been made in 1833 for the Capitol, but because Uriah Levy, a Jewish naval officer, had donated the statue and had it made by a French sculptor, David d'Angers. It was never placed in the Capitol at that time. It was placed outside. Mar then got permission from Tyler to move it to the north grounds of the White House, where it overlooked now the Jackson statue, and the story that is there. So John Saul, who has descendants living in Washington, none of the personal papers of any of these people exist. But John Saul came to America in 1853 from someplace in Ireland. The family does not know. It's not on Ancestry where in Ireland he came from. To work for Andrew Jackson Downing in designing the public grounds that Downing then took over in 1851, the mall. His commission is known that in Washington that he worked on Corcoran's house. Corcoran was the great philanthropist in Washington, and John Saul's nursery on 7th Street Road, as it was called, 7th Street. We're now here at 10th Street, so 3 blocks away and maybe 2 miles up the road, 3 miles up the road, was in green, the nursery that John Saul had there, and these are the 3 parts of the Corcoran estate across the street. That it was also on the other side of 7th Street Road. It was, that whole estate was taken over, or part of it taken over, for a Civil War Army hospital. And on the lower right, you see the buildings and the landscape behind it that were done by Saul. Going back to Saul became a major horticulturalist who shipped all around the country. When I was in California, I found collections that he had sent to California. In 1867, the Capitol grounds were redesigned by Olmsted, and the whole game changed. Everything that the earlier people had done was wiped out. So you see Olmsted's plan here, and then a photograph, aerial, that's showing how it was in fact carried out. Those are the grounds of the Capitol that we know today. In his major part of Saul's career was to serve as one of three commissioners the Parking Commission, as it was called, parks, not our sense of park, but parks, of during the early 1870s, of planting trees along all the streets of Washington. In this case, a street leading up to the mall. The mall is on the snow side of this, ginkgo trees that were a frame, Capitol Hill, where 3 streets come together, elms on Main Avenue, an arch of elms, and of course we have to go back to the horse chestnut where we started. This is the 1300 block of 13th Street, planted with American chestnuts.